The Kasur attack on the 6th of September 1965 was the Indian move that opened the Khaim-Karan sector and set the stage for everything that followed at Asal-Uttar. Indian forces crossed from the Khaim-Karan side toward the Pakistani border area around Kasur, hoping to widen the war, threaten an important sector, and force Pakistan to respond away from Kashmir. It was an offensive born from strategic necessity rather than local convenience. Yet the attack did not develop into the clean breakthrough its planners might have hoped for. Its early movement showed courage and pressure, but also the friction that eats away at offensive momentum. Bridges, artillery, timing, terrain, and coordination would matter more than the neat shape of the plan. If you would like to move beyond the podcast, you can see my available books at militaryauthor.me. And at trackpads.com, you will find magazines and galleries with hundreds of thousands of photos and videos to explore. India's decision to attack in Punjab came after Pakistan's pressure in Kashmir, and the offensive toward Akhnor created a serious threat. Indian leaders and commanders did not want to fight only on the ground selected by Pakistan. By crossing the international border, India forced the war onto a broader front and placed pressure near areas Pakistan could not ignore. The Lahore sector received much attention, but the Khaim-Karan-Kasur axis had its own operational significance. An Indian advance there could threaten Pakistani communications, pull in reserves, and complicate Pakistan's ability to continue operations elsewhere. In that sense, the attack was part of a strategic counterstroke. It was intended not merely to gain ground, but to change the tempo of the war. The ground between Khaim-Karan and Kasur looked more promising for mechanized movement than the mountains of Kashmir, but it was still difficult country for an advancing force. The sector was shaped by cultivated fields, villages, canals, drains, embankments, and road-bound approaches. A unit moving forward had to do more than cross a line on a map. It had to keep its infantry and armor together, protect its flanks, maintain communications, handle obstacles, and bring up artillery and supplies fast enough to support the next movement. Even a short advance could become complicated if a bridge was damaged, a route was blocked, or enemy fire forced units to deploy earlier than expected. Offensive warfare is not just movement, it is organized movement under resistance. The Indian formation most closely tied to this sector was 4th Mountain Division, which was already an unusual instrument for the task. It was being asked to operate in flat border country where armor and roads could dominate, even though its structure and experience were shaped by very different assumptions. Supporting armor and artillery gave the advance weight, but the operation still depended on coordination between units that had to move through a confusing and contested landscape. The aim was to push forward from the Indian side, threaten Kasur's approaches, and force Pakistan to divert attention and resources. But each mile taken had to be held, supplied, and connected to the rest of the force. A thrust without secure depth can become exposed quickly. The first hours carried the energy of initiative. Indian troops crossed the border and moved into Pakistani territory, creating exactly the kind of wider crisis that New Delhi wanted to impose after Grand Slam. Forward positions were challenged, and the sudden expansion of the war demanded Pakistani reaction. For soldiers on the ground, the crossing would not have felt like a grand strategic maneuver. It meant moving through fields and along tracks under the risk of artillery, small arms fire, air attack, and confusion about where friendly and enemy units actually were. The opening of a front is often described in broad political language, but at the tactical level, it is a sequence of local tests. Units advance, halt, report, adjust, and try to understand whether the enemy is bending or preparing to strike back. Momentum was the problem. The attack did not collapse immediately, but it did not gather the speed and coherence needed to settle the sector. Pakistani resistance, prepared or improvised, made every next step harder. Artillery could slow movement, force infantry to take cover, and separate tanks from the men who needed to protect them. Obstacles and water features could interrupt the rhythm of an advance. Bridges and crossings mattered because they determined whether armor could move freely or had to wait. When a formation pauses at an obstacle under fire, the pause spreads backward. Vehicles bunch up, orders become stale, and the enemy gains the minutes needed to reinforce, observe, and plan a reply. This is one of the important teaching points of the Kasur attack. An offensive can achieve surprise and still fail to exploit it fully. Surprise is an opening condition, not a guarantee. It has to be converted into speed, and speed has to be converted into dislocation of the enemy's system. If the attacker reaches a canal but cannot cross it in time, or captures ground but cannot push reserves through, the initial shock fades. By late morning or afternoon, what began as forward motion can become a collection of local problems. This is especially true in armored warfare, where the apparent speed of tanks can hide the slower pace of the whole combined arms column behind them. The Indian attack also revealed how hard it was to coordinate infantry, armor, artillery, and engineers in real time. Infantry had to clear and hold ground that tanks could not safely ignore. Tanks had to avoid outrunning infantry into areas where anti-tank fire could ambush them. Artillery had to suppress Pakistani positions and protect movement, but fires had to be timed and observed accurately. Engineers had to deal with mines, demolitions, tracks, and crossings, often under pressure and with incomplete information. Communications connected all of this, and imperfect communications made every misunderstanding costly. A general listener should picture not a clean wave moving forward, but many parts trying to stay aligned while the enemy worked to pull them apart. Pakistan's defensive reaction in the sector mattered because it bought time for a larger counterstroke. The Indian advance threatened, but it did not paralyze Pakistani command. As the situation clarified, Pakistani forces could begin thinking not only about stopping the attack, but about answering it with armor. This is the link between the Kasur attack and the later thrust toward Kemkaran. By pushing forward but not achieving decisive results, Indian forces created a forward and potentially vulnerable situation. Pakistan saw an opportunity to use its armored strength to reverse the pressure. What began as India's attempt to widen the front would soon invite Pakistan's effort to break it open in the opposite direction. The episode is not a story of simple Indian failure. Strategically, the crossing of the border did force Pakistan to broaden its response and helped relieve pressure created by the offensive toward Akhnur. That was a major effect. But tactically and operationally, the Kasur attack showed the limits of offensive action when preparation, terrain, and timing do not fully align. There is a difference between creating a problem for the enemy and solving the battlefield problem in front of one's own troops. India achieved the first more clearly than the second in this sector. The advance forced Pakistan to react, but it did not produce the secure, deep result that would have prevented the dangerous counterattack to come. For 4th Mountain Division, the aftermath of the attack was especially uncomfortable. Having moved forward under difficult conditions, the division now had to deal with the possibility that Pakistan's stronger armored formations would strike back hard. The question changed from how far Indian troops could advance toward Kasur to how they could avoid being overrun if the enemy counterstroke arrived in strength. This shift is common in war, but brutal for the soldiers experiencing it. One day's attack can become the next day's defensive emergency. Roads used for advance may have to support withdrawal. Artillery that covered movement forward must now help slow pursuit. Commanders must decide when persistence becomes danger and when stepping back becomes the wiser form of resistance. The human cost of this kind of fighting should not be lost in the operational language. The Kasur attack involved men moving through danger, units losing contact, casualties being carried back, vehicles breaking down or being hit, and civilians suddenly finding their homes near a widening front. A border village can become a battlefield without having chosen any part in the war. Farmers' fields become approaches, irrigation works become obstacles, and roads become routes for guns and ambulances. The soldiers involved did not know that later memory would focus so heavily on Asal Uttar's tank wrecks. They were living the uncertain opening act, where the shape of the future battle was not yet clear, and every decision carried consequences beyond what they could see. The Kasur attack matters because it explains why the Indian defense at Asal Uttar had to be built under pressure. It was not formed in a calm classroom exercise or on ground chosen months in advance. It emerged for an offensive that lost momentum, a widening war that demanded quick adaptation, and a sector where Pakistan now had an opportunity for a powerful armored reply. The lesson is not that offensives are foolish or that defense is always superior. The lesson is that armored warfare punishes incomplete momentum. If an attack crosses a border but cannot keep moving, cannot secure crossings, and cannot impose lasting disorder on the enemy, it may create the conditions for the enemy's counterstroke. Around Kemkaran, That is exactly what happened. By the end of the Kasur attack's opening phase, the road to Asal-Uttar was much clearer. India had achieved the larger purpose of widening the war, but in the Khem-Karan sector, its forward movement had not produced a decisive local result. Pakistan had been challenged, but not broken. The terrain had shown its power to slow plans, and the demands of combined arms had proved unforgiving. Now, both sides faced a new problem. India had to decide how to turn vulnerability into defense, while Pakistan had to decide how to turn armored strength into exploitation. The next step would be the withdrawal to Asal-Uttar, where retreat would become preparation, and the failed momentum of one attack would help shape the trap for another.
You've been listening to Famous Tank Battles. These battles were never just about machines. They were about doctrine, terrain, firepower, logistics, and the hard problem of turning shock into victory. For more military history writing and books, visit militaryauthor.me. And for magazines, podcasts, and a massive archive of military photos and video, visit trackpads.com. Thanks for listening.